pain and painful emotion. I must unavoidably commence with some trite and indisputable observations, but I will be as brief as possible. Pain and pleasure are the stimulants of that activity which is the source of all our knowledge and all our arts, and which is itself the most universal of pleasures. It is impossible for us to conceive of life being developed without both of these stimulants. Hunger, thirst, bodily uneasiness are constantly giving movement to the whole animal creation. Pain, that acts as a stimulant to action, blends with or is lost in the sense of effort, or the vigorous muscular exertion it calls forth. Very acute pain paralyzes or subdues, but the prick and the sting that stimulate to energetic movement are forgotten in the energy they produce. In many of our motives it is difficult to say whether pain or pleasure predominates. Hunger having been once gratified, there is a prospect of pleasure, as well as a present pain, in the desire for food. Generally there is in desire the anticipation of some pleasure, and also a direct pain from the absence of that pleasure. If now this important state of mind, which we call desire, be thus a blending of pain and pleasure, we see at once how indispensable a part pain performs in human existence. Pain also is the great conservator of life. It gives note of danger. The memory of pain is our great safeguard and protection. If the fire did not hurt the child, it would not withdraw its finger. If the hurt were not remembered, there would be no salutary dread of the fire afterwards. So also the pain that arises from any abnormal condition of our own organism draws our attention to the ailment, imposes rest, suggests remedial actions, and teaches caution for the future. We should die very rapidly if it were not for the pain of disease. If a personal want initiates the activity of the individual, it is sympathy with each other which lies at the basis of human society, and sympathy is, in the first instance, chiefly called forth by pain or dread of some affliction. We sympathize with each other's joys no less than with each other's griefs. But even when we sympathize strongly with each other's joys, it is where there is some sense of escape from threatened or probable affliction. And generally speaking, this form of the sentiment is of later culture or development. Society, in its earliest stages, owes more to the sympathy which is called forth by pain, by wounds, by death, that sympathy which enlists the passions of 20 men in the suffering and calamity of one, is the rude initiator of criminal justice and moral reprobation. Could I point to any great fact which shows more distinctly how pain and pleasure lie together at the very roots of human existence? They indeed are twisted together in every fiber, in every leaf, in every blossom and fruit of the great tree of life. It would be idle to pretend that disease is not an evil. It is, if you reckon amongst diseases all the distressing bodily results of age and poverty, the greatest and the most widely spread of all the evils that afflict society. But if you regard society at large, you will find that these bodily distresses are eventually leading to combined social action for their relief. And if you regard the family group, you cannot fail to perceive that where the sick, the aged, and infirm are cared for and preserved alive, there is a development of compassion, of tenderness, of fortitude, and of other states of mind which greatly enrich our human lives. I do not say that the presence of an invalid is always salutary to the temper of the other inmates of the house. We all know that it sometimes operates in a very undesirable manner. But, speaking generally of human life, it tends to soften, to elevate, to teach self-denial. I look through the village of Gravenhurst. I could point to more than one household where the tone of thought and feeling has been evidently raised by the presence of its invalid. One I could name where the husband is naturally rough and boisterous, and the wife somewhat sharp and shrewish, given much, they say, to scandal. Our favorite daughter has been long confined to her room by illness. There is at least one chamber in that house where the voice of anger is never heard, where the thoughts take a gentle and times a lofty tone. The wife drops her acrid criticism as she enters it, and spares even her next-door neighbor. And for the boisterous husband, I have known him walk a mile out of his way in the keen March wind to bring the first primrose or the first violet to the imprisoned invalid. He knew where the earliest grew, and would have been not a little vexed if anyone had discovered his secret, and anticipated him in his trivial gift. A man mostly absorbed in money-making, and his calculations of profit and loss, lends himself wholly to this slight but disinterested service, yet not altogether so slight. To her who could no longer seek them herself, where they grow on the green earth, and in the fresh air, and beneath the rolling clouds, what an intense and exquisite pleasure this little gift would bring. He has told me himself that she wept with joy when she saw them. The tears were very near his own eyes when he told me this. And mark how contrast and limitation heighten our pleasure. To the pale prisoner, the scent and beauty of 1,000 flowers were concentrated in a solitary primrose, pale almost as herself. To prisoners of a certain stamp, a few simple joys, shut in with them in their cell, shall expand till they fill the whole capacity for enjoyment. From pain, we are easily led to the dread of pain, to the resentment that follows upon pain, to anger, hatred, fear, and all the list of depressing and inflammatory passions, dire inmates to the human breast which admits them too readily or retains them too long. Yet what passion is there which, in its due degree and place, is not serviceable to happiness, or is not a happiness itself? What we call bad passions owe their badness to a defective state of the intelligence, as when emulation becomes envy in narrow minds, or love becomes jealousy. What fundamental passion is there of the human mind that you would eradicate? Not revenge. You know that this is needful to self-preservation. You know that when it is felt sympathetically, it becomes a noble indignation, summoning defenders round the weak against the strong. But the passion you urge, that prompted the injury which has to be revenged, this might be eradicated, and then all would be peace. What is that assailant? What the passion that commences the strife and gives the first blow? It may be any passion that has not learned its limits, and has to learn its limits by this very retaliation it provokes. It may be cupidity, and cupidity in itself is but the desire for some good, or it may be the love of power, the desire of governing others, and making them subject to our will. And you will pause long before you eradicate this love of power. Here also there is a passion which has to learn its limits from the resistance it meets with. Amongst the various tempers of men, some prompt to govern and direct, and some to seek the guidance and government of others. The more you examine the constitution of society and the origin of its government, the less disposed will you be to interfere with this natural difference in the temper and passions of men. Then again, consider how the rudest passions of our nature become, in the progressive development of man, refined, how they enter into new combinations, and perhaps would seem base in itself, becomes an essential element of a noble sentiment. No passion, at first sight, appears more degrading than fear. Yet fear, by some admixture of thought, becomes reverence, becomes moral responsibility, enters into the sentiment of duty. If the ill opinion of others had excited no fear in us, the control which a society exercises by turns over each of its members could have had no existence. The moral opinion or force of society could have had no existence. So anger, which leads in the first instance to wild injustice, gives to the advanced mind that moral indignation without which there could be no strength of character. To these transmutations we may revert again, but neither here nor elsewhere could I hope to exhaust the subject. Nor is it needful. The reader will himself supply additional illustrations.